Welcome to Catastrophes. This is a podcast about disasters, why disasters happen, and the factors that make them happen. We discuss the underlying effects and the implications of disasters, but then also their long-term consequences. And today we have a really interesting episode covering a series of volcanic eruptions in Lewotobi Laki Laki in Indonesia. Alongside that, we are also going to be discussing some recent news that came out about warming Southern Ocean and a quick question. But overall, the purpose of today's episode is not to demean or diminish the experiences of people who are facing these events, but rather explore, question, critique, and ask why these disasters are happening the way they do and the way they are unfolding. So with that, let's begin. And welcome back to Catastrophes. I am excited to be back after a month and a half-ish, 2 months of a little bit of a hiatus where I was on vacation. But really, I was also thinking about how I can improve this podcast and really, add more information, but make it more tangible and digestible, and kind of talk about the overall long-term implications of many of these disasters, which I don't think I've done enough of. So I'm excited to bring that element to you. And we're going to be doing that more through each episode. And I'm going to be covering a few disasters in more depth to do that. So I'm excited to bring that change to you. Today, though, we have an interesting episode. I'm going to talk about a quick question asked by my wife. It was very timely because the question is about volcanoes, and we are covering Indonesia's Mount Laki Laki or Lewotobi. And then I wanted to share a little bit of news related to a paper that came out of the University of Southampton in the UK. Today's quick question, an interesting one. And I promise I'm not just saying that because, she's my wife. The question is, what are the different kinds of volcanic eruptions? So felt this was a great quick question. I can probably cover it in under a minute. There are basically two different kinds of eruptions that we see from volcanoes. There is the explosive eruption and the effusive eruption. So the explosive eruption is what you would think, just like in a movie, where there is a large seismic sonic boom, and out of the top of the volcano or wherever the main cone is that is erupting, we see an explosion of lava, magma, pyroclastic flow, and ash. And it goes upwards, and then it is really directed by the wind flow. So explosive volcanoes, and that's really what we're going to be talking about today, are an interesting phenomenon because they are highly publicized, very, very big media presence and such. Effusive volcanoes are really interesting as well because they don't have the same basically pattern of eruption. Really what effusive volcanoes do is they effectively run. So magma and lava are different parts of an effusive volcano. Magma is the mixture of rock, dissolved gases, and kind of everything we think of like the hot, parts of like a volcano, I guess you could say. And once magma reaches the surface, we call it lava. And so once lava is basically outside of the volcano, that's what's really running. So in an effusive eruption, we see lava run quickly down the sides of volcanoes. But it's important to know that it's not slow running lava. Sometimes they can be very fast running, and it can catch people off guard. So, and typically we see effusive eruptions. We can see them in Iceland. We can also see them in Hawaii. Whereas today, talking about an explosive eruption in Indonesia. But before we get into that, I wanted to quickly cover an interesting new article that came out. It came out, I think, within the last few days. And I will link a article to the conversation, which does, again, a good job of providing enough nuance that the message isn't lost, and it doesn't oversimplify either. I'll also provide the scientific article. But the overall, I guess, like paper topic is rising surface salinity and declining sea ice, a new Southern Ocean state revealed by satellites. And it's really interesting. So Dr. Alessandro Silvano out of the University of Southampton has published what is, I would say, a pretty good paper. And I think that there is some validity to seeing how other scientists react before taking this at 100%, face value, seeing what other people are saying, and making sure that we're not, there might be an error or whatever, and we just want to make sure that, we're not 100% believing it. We want to be critical of what we're reading and everything like that. So that's kind of the point I would make just before we go into this. So the article title of the Conversations article is Completely Unexpected. Antarctic sea ice may be in terminal decline due to rising Southern Ocean salinity. So it's really interesting. And a quick primer. Salinity within the ocean, from even if you do a quick Google search, has really been unchanging over the last however many years. And it's the consensus that the ocean salinity is not increasing or decreasing. However, what Dr. Silvano is suggesting is that there is a shift, particularly in the Antarctic, where there's some processes that are actually causing increased salinity in particular areas, and this is basically causing further warming of some of the ice sheets that are already in the water and in the Antarctic. And so I'll just point out a few key passages that I think are interesting from the conversation. This is one of the first ones. Obviously, there's a change. That's why they're writing about this article. But over the last 15 years, we've actually seen a change in ocean salinity, temperature, and sea ice, particularly around 2015. Surface salinity, or the amount of salt, in the Southern Ocean began to rise rapidly, just as sea ice extent started to crash. This reversal was completely unexpected. For decades, the surface has been getting fresher and colder, helping sea ice expand. To understand why this matters, it helps to think of the Southern Ocean as a series of layers. Normally, the cold, fresh surface water sits on the top of water. Saltier water is deeper below. This layering, or stratification as scientists call it, traps heat in the ocean depths, keeping surface water cool and helping sea ice to form. Salt water is denser and therefore heavier, and so when surface water becomes saltier, they sink more readily, stirring the ocean's layers and allowing heat from the deep to rise. This upwards heat influx can melt sea ice from below even during winter, making it harder for sea ice to reform. The vertical circulation also draws up more salt from deeper layers. And this is really interesting because this is, like he was saying before, saltier water is denser. And so typically it's not going to be at the top. We've seen cold, fresh water sit towards the top of the ocean. But the article and what he's saying suggests that in the Southern Ocean, we're seeing a trend in the opposite way. And he has a few really good metaphors. I won't, talk about the whole thing. A few really good examples. And he also mentions, some of the effects to wildlife, but also the global greater implications, which I will quickly cover right here. Why should we really care is what this next section gets to. Antarctica is no longer the stable frozen continent we once believed it to be. It is changing rapidly, and in a way that current climate models didn't foresee. Until recently, those models assumed a warming world would increase precipitation and ice melting, freshening surface water and helping keep Antarctic ice relatively stable. However, that assumption no longer holds. And I think this is articulated in a way that it makes it understandable for everybody. And that's why really I wanted to share. If you're interested in the full scientific article, there is, a lot of scientific information that can be a little bit difficult to digest if you don't have that background. Whereas the conversation article does, I think, the topic justice. And overall, the article, I think for me, points to this trend of and shows how integrated and interconnected our systems are, which is a really important and somewhat lost art of kind of analyzing throughout the world. The Southern Ocean affects the north, all around the world, just by virtue of the ocean currents and bringing warmer water or colder water around the earth. Like a lot of our oceans, they dictate a lot of the weather on land. And then as we see sea ice particularly decline, it's going to be really interesting the long-term effects that we see from basically the rising salinity in the Southern Ocean. And before I get into Mount Laki Laki, I'm going to take a quick break and we'll be right back. Okay, welcome back. Now we're going to discuss Mount Laki Laki Lewotobi. So I'm going to refer to it as Mount Laki Laki, but what you need to know is that there's basically two openings for this volcano. And Lewotobi is basically in I believe Indonesian language, it's the husband, whereas Laki Laki is the wife. And Laki Laki itself, so both of them are in a eruptive state. And if you've heard me discuss volcanoes before, that's okay. We'll cover a little bit of information I've talked about in the past, but I'll give my quick background on volcanoes. Typically, eruption patterns for volcanoes are more of a series of eruptions where we see over the course of months. I like to kind of call them like a marathon of eruptions, a marathon of activity, where a volcano will become active and then there will be peaks to that activity. And we've seen actually about 3 peaks for Mount Laki Laki's volcanic eruption kind of profile. For Mount Laki Laki, the context is it is on one of the far east islands. There's a series of island chains that connect one of the islands where many people live, Java, and then there is the next island over, that's Bali, that's the one most people are typically familiar with, and then there's a few more islands more to the east. And this island is on Flores Timor. And what's really interesting about the kind of pattern of Lewotobi or Mount Laki Laki is how it has erupted and how it's actually influenced a lot of the people around there. So we have to go back all the way to December 2023, but really we're going to cover from November 2024 to current times. The beginning of the activity period for Mount Laki Laki began December 2023. So it's been ongoing for a year and a half now. And again, we've seen these peaks. Going back to November 2024, we see a large eruption at about midnight on November 3rd, which generated pyroclastic flow, which traveled down all directions of the volcano. It also ejected ballistic projectiles and had a number of gases that were kind of released from it. During that eruption, there was basically an elevation of their coding system. So they go from 1 to 4 on their alert, and it was raised to a level 4, which is the highest. When we see level 4, we often see evacuations from a particular zone. And I wish I could show it as a photo, but basically you have a giant map, and then they will basically draw in circles which zones are highly, high risk, medium risk, low risk for like ballistic blocks, for gas, for kind of pyroclastic flow and all that kind of stuff. Whereas with this one, we see 7 kilometers within Mount Laki Laki in November be the hazard zone. So if you are within 7 kilometers, you need to evacuate. That was on November 3rd. And we note that there's a few smaller villages around Mount Laki Laki. And one of the, I guess, context setting things that's really important for talking about volcanoes is there oftentimes is a lot of people who live near volcanoes throughout the world because the land is so fertile. You can be a farmer very successfully because of how fertile the land has been, largely because of the deposits of high minerals. So good farmland, and there always tends to be people around volcanoes. And this is the case with Mount Laki Laki. There are a number of villages. On November 5th, we actually see 9 people pass away as a result of the eruption. 63 had a serious or a minor injury. And that's partially from the effects of gases, but then also the ballistic blocks and eruption pattern that we see. One of the villages that is 3 kilometers northwest of the actual summit where the eruption was where a few of these fatalities came from, unfortunately. In that village itself, there's approximately 11,000 people, all of which were evacuated to unaffected area 15 to 20 kilometers from the volcano. So the effects of the November 3rd eruption, November 3rd eruption, it happened at midnight, and then it happens again like 20 minutes later. So it's November 3rd and 4th, is that, again, we see 63 injuries, 9 people die, and then we see large blanketed areas affected by ash. And so that's one of the commonalities of an eruption, of an explosive eruption, is ash will shoot out in a giant plume, and depending on the wind direction, that will influence where the ash will fall. And so for Laki Laki on November 3rd and 4th, we actually see 7 kilometers around the volcano itself are covered with ash and, some of these ballistic blocks. And they are exactly like you picture, they can be giant ballistic blocks that can go through people's houses, windows, and really damage a lot of areas. We see 6 villages within this 7 kilometer range where the ash was. About 6 to 10 villages be significantly affected. We also see multiple crater zones from huge ballistic blocks, the furthest of which was 7 kilometers away. And it measured 13 meters wide, 3 meters deep. They can be massive. And then probably you would have saw, if you were following this eruption or this activity, that there was there had to be cancellations to Bali for the airports, and no planes could fly to Bali at that time. I think it was for 24 hours. And that was really the big news, that if you look at any of the reports, that was the big coverage for it. No more flights to Bali. Whereas we actually see quite a significant response and recovery to the November 3rd and 4th event. And yeah, what you need to really take away from that event is huge effects from a large plume of ash. And they are still recovering partially from that event itself, partially because ash is so difficult to get rid of once it reaches farmland and can destroy any sort of crop that you have. In the previous episode I believe it was in November, I talked about kind of their response and how the government of Indonesia, along with some NGOs, were actually able to evacuate people quite well in terms of the capacity of what they have. They were able to relocate them to somewhere else, and I wasn't able to find any information on where they were relocated to. However, I did find more information. So as of February 25th, we actually see 250 families be relocated from the eruption itself. So they were, from November to February, provided temporary housing, and then the government provided 50 duplex houses to accommodate all of these families. and they're looking to build basically a few more and continue this process. But really interesting to see them work so quickly. Now, the kind of drawback to this article that I've found is that it doesn't actually say anything about where they've been relocated. They might be in the same area. I really doubt it. I don't actually know though. And but I think it's just a point worth noting that that's good work. Being able to relocate families away from, ideally, the eruption, kind of that eruption zone, that hazard zone, that's good work. And then we see, so that's basically they're recovering, they're getting back to normal, they're kind of going back to their day-to-day lives. If they're living in temporary housing, they're moving back to possibly new housing. We actually see, and then in February, the total relocation of upwards to 250 families. Then in March, we actually see another eruption where the Indonesian Disaster and Mitigation Agency, the National Disaster Management Agency, raised the highest alert again on Thursday, March 21st. And again, you would have seen possible delays to flights to Bali, to and from Bali. Some flights were canceled, and that was really the large international coverage of this volcano. Whereas we know that there's quite a bit more. On the March 21st disaster, we actually see 390 people be evacuated from villages that were at risk of being impacted by the eruption. Whereas, not as many as the first one. But the agency, the Disaster Management Agency, notes in a few articles that there was a risk from the actual pyroclastic flow and of the eruption itself. And particularly, they were worried about the drinking water and the viability of water, particularly if it gets contaminated by volcanic ash or any material like that. You can't drink it. So they really were trying to think about, how do we get people to either evacuate, or do we need them to shelter in place, stay there, and then we can bring them more supplies. As of March 22nd, 23rd, the Disaster Management Agency was able to assist roughly 4,000 to 5,000 people. Again, take it for what you will. I think there's a few discrepancy in numbers across a few different articles. But there is an interesting article that came out on March 21st that kind of summarizes all of it. And it's interesting. And again, I would tell you to, we have to think critically about some of the things that we're reading. But the article's title is Central Government Praised for Effective Response from Mount Laki Laki. So I'll take just a minute to read parts of this article. Because I think it's interesting. So there's, and it's from the Indonesian News Agency, and I have no context for how it was written, who it was written by. So again, and it's written in Jakarta, which is not very close to where this eruption took place. Anyways, part of the article talks about some of the people who were running the disaster response, but also part of the recovery. And I think that's where really the headline comes from. So it's said that after the March 21st eruption, that the central government was trying to develop a permanent housing solution for some of the communities affected. They wanted to rebuild houses that were further away. So as of, that February 25th event, or February 25th, we note that there was 250 families relocated to temporary housing and then given duplexes that were more permanent. Whereas this article, a month and a half later after that particular article, is suggesting that they're trying to relocate more people, approximately 500 families, which did reside near the volcano, and then they're trying to relocate them away. But as a whole, there's approximately 4,000 to 6,000 people who were evacuated. And again, conflicting reports on if they were able to return home after the November eruption itself. So we don't know how many people are there and how many have returned, but we do know that there is semi-permanent / permanent relocation of some people. And there's a bit of it can be seen generally in a positive light that we've been able to relocate people out of harm's way. But at the same time, there's also this element of, what about if they have a permanent job that requires the land, if it's farming land perhaps, or if it's something to do with the local economy. A lot of questions still remain. But again, generally, I think there's a consensus amongst all of these news articles, no matter how biased they are or not, that the central government's response and the National Disaster Management Agency did a good job of making sure people could evacuate quickly, but then also trying to get them into new housing. So that's, again, the context for the last several months. And what happened on March 13th and March 20th to kind of prompt a few of those articles is there was another large eruption. And I should have kind of led with that before I got into the March 21st article. So as of March 21st, we see a giant eruption, a major eruption, occur again around midnight. And the height of the eruption, or the plume, is 8,000 meters above the summit. So this is quite a large eruption pattern itself. But as a whole, because of the people who are already displaced / relocated, we note that there is no fatalities and there's only 2 injuries from burns, and amongst the plane cancellations and flights that were delayed. So again, I think there's part of the success from the central government in having people who were displaced and relocated not be near the volcano that is still active. I think there is success in doing that. And I think that's an interesting component to all of this. As we continue on, so from January to June, there are smaller eruptions. But again, if you Google Mount Laki Laki eruption, you'll see giant ash plumes that really tower above. And it isn't until on June 11th, a deep volcanic earthquake, many of them occur. So basically, deep volcanic earthquakes are just like the tremors, or they're like the shaking of around the volcano. And there isn't always a perfect science to it for analyzing it, but if we see increased volcanic activity, we might be able to tell that there could be an eruption coming, but it's not a given. So we see the daily increase in underwater volcanic earthquakes. We see it go from 8 to 10 daily to about 50 in 2 hours after June 17th. And as that June 17th rolls around, we see the escalation from alert level from 1 to 3. And again, 4 is the highest. I forgot to mention that before. So the public is warned to stay 8 kilometers away from the summit. And again, we've seen ash 7 kilometers on the November and March events. So 7 and 8 kilometers stay away is probably a pretty good range. We see a large explosive eruption at 5:30 on June 17th produce significant ash plumes that rose 10 kilometers above the summit. It also resulted in pyroclastic flow down multiple flanks of the volcano itself. So there's a few villages that were in harm's way and were able to be evacuated. What's really interesting is that for the evacuations, we note that they were somewhat effective in terms of the timing. And again, this is based on documentation that it's not, I can't confirm it. I have no way to do that. But we note that the evacuations have gone quite well. And for this particular incident, the big outcomes is that there is a number of flights that are canceled or disrupted / delayed, and we don't actually see any fatalities or any injuries from the June 17th event. What we do see as a result of all of these eruptions, however, is a long scale and really difficult recovery. The only way to really recover from a volcanic eruption where the ash plumes are, going very, very high and spreading all around is time and then actually cleaning off the ash. So it can be really difficult. And when we see like these big ballistic blocks, they're so heavy that it takes heavy machinery to actually move them if they do get in the way of roads or in the centers of villages and such. So recovery can be really prolonged. And considering, again, a volcano and its eruptions are more of a series of events, it can disrupt and delay any sort of recovery starting. So going back to kind of analyzing if the central government has done a good job in response and recovery, I think there has to be a little bit of credit given to them for relocating people and not letting them, go back to an active volcano, and helping them start to recover by building permanent housing. While it isn't for all 4,000 people, and upwards to 250 to 500 families that are given this temporary / permanent housing, I think there is a little bit of good work that it shows. And again, the recovery is really difficult to fully implement because of this unrest that continues within Mount Laki Laki. And it will be difficult if we see, even more volcanic eruptions and pyroclastic flow and ballistic blocks. But again, I think we can take away that overall, if you begin to recover by relocating people away from the hazardous areas, particularly, that 7-kilometer radius, I think you're starting to be on the right track. But it's also worth noting that every time you evacuate somebody, it can be a very traumatic experience. It can be very difficult. And we also need to be conscientious of, their identities with the land itself, where they have grown up, kind of the social patterns of those villages and everything like that. So evacuations are very disruptive. And if they're occurring off and on over the course of a year, it can be really difficult to get people to want to evacuate. Sometimes they might see that, this happened several months ago, so I might not need to take this one as serious. And again, I think the credit to the central government and the National Emergency Management Agency should be that they have relocated some of those people, the 4,000 that were really close to the volcano's proximity. They've prevented them from, going back and continuing to evacuate off and on for the course of last 15 months, And I think there's quite a few lessons to learn from that and takeaways. But the overall implication to, again, living near these volcanoes is, and it really poses the question, how close is too close? And that economic benefit of really good land, fertile land, but also the cultural significance of some parts of land that's close to volcanoes and so on is a really interesting question, and one that I hope to cover in a future episode. So thank you for sticking with me up to this point. Next week, I have a bit of an interesting episode talking about some of the recent events in Canada, largely around mountains and how we've seen mountain disasters unfold over the course of a few years. And I'm hoping to have a few guests come on the show and talk about it from their perspective, and really excited to bring you guys new content, more engaging in the sense of bringing on different perspectives, but then also kind of talking about the long-term and the short-term implications of how disasters are happening and what it's doing to our rural spaces, but also our cities and just people in general. So thank you for sticking with me this far. If you have not already subscribed, please subscribe to Apple Podcast, Spotify, also YouTube. if you could leave me a review, it's always greatly appreciated. And if you ever have any disasters you want reviewed, or for me to talk about a quick question, maybe, you can always email me at catastrophepodcast@gmail.com. I'm also getting more active into Instagram and TikTok world. So if you want to follow me there, I am at Catastrophe Podcast. And that is all I got for today. Thank you very much.